I'm here at DAppCon 2022 in Berlin on this lovely boat. The day is coming to an end. People are starting to have drinks, and actually we're gonna have them merge in a couple of hours. But I'm here with Colfax of GitPOAP.
Yes.
Thanks for joining me.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Tell me a little bit about GitPOAP and why it's cool.
Definitely. Yeah. So I'm one of the founders of GitPOAP. What GitPOAP is it's a platform for awarding blockchain-based badges in the form of NFTs as POAPs, if you're familiar, for software contributions on GitHub. And we're using that sort of as a building block to begin with giving people actually credit and reputation and reward for their contributions. And we're starting with software and we're expanding beyond software pretty soon, actually.
So it's cool. It's a product that's built on top of the POAP infrastructure. Like I was just talking with Patricio earlier, and there'll be a video of that also on this channel if you want to check that out. And POAP is an attestation service, and like they've, I think, tried to hit the use case of proving that something happened, typically sort of in the physical realm. So that could be like meeting someone. It could also extend to digital in terms of you prove that you've listened to a podcast within a specific time frame or something like that. But you guys are building on top of this infrastructure with a specific use case, which is you've contributed to open source software, or you've contributed to like a public good. What's unique about this use case, and what kinds of things does it unlock? Because like people have been contributing on open source for forever, but like what does this particular thing unlock for developers, but also like broadly for the open source ecosystem?
That's a great question. And so POAPs are an interesting tool to essentially bring like a record of what somebody's done on chain. And that comes in the form of like owning this NFT, which is a POAP. And like with software, then like once we have an on-chain record of who's contributed to which software projects, like the big one that I was just having a conversation over there earlier about open source software is funding projects. And it's difficult to fund, especially public goods projects. And sometimes it's difficult to identify where you should channel funds to have an impact on a project.
Yeah.
And so once we bring the contribution records on chain, it's very easy then to identify who the core developers are building these projects, and we can funnel channel funds directly to them.
Yeah, so directly to the people that are,
Exactly.
right. So like, and I mean, it's actually direct funneling because you probably have their Ethereum address. You have some payment address that you can send money.
Exactly. And you can immediately tell like how much they've contributed and send money directly to them. Even before you get to funding, we can do things like provide utilities that can be free for core developers to different projects. For example, I was just talking to somebody, maybe we can award, free Infura keys to anybody who's a top level contributor to one of the primary projects that's an open source good in the Ethereum ecosystem, to incentivize more development and to reward people for all the hard work they're doing. Or for example, another thing recently for DevCon builder ticket applications, they actually asked for your POAP collection so they could evaluate how much you've contributed to the ecosystem, and GitPOAPs gave you a boost on getting a discounted ticket to DevCon too. So fun stuff like that as well.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
How does the attestation work though? So let's get into maybe some of the technical stuff. Let's say I've got an open source project. Maybe I have some funding. I want to reward those who are contributing with a GitPOAP POAP. The remuneration or like funding of those developers can maybe come later, but how does that work? Is it like this? Is GitPOAP looking at commits? How does one gauge the quality of those commits? Is it when a pull request gets merged? Like, how does that all work? Yeah,
you're asking all the good questions. So we work directly with maintainers to onboard all the projects that we award GitPOAPs to, because we want to share with them sort of the vision around what we're doing and how we can actually support their project. And what we've defined as an atomic unit of contribution, so like what we actually define as a contribution is a merged pull request. Yeah. Because so people love POAPs, which is a good thing. The bad thing is that a lot of people want to like farm or like get POAPs in a dishonest way in a sense. Yeah. And so all pull requests to projects are merged by or are reviewed by a human. A pull request, if you're not familiar, is basically just like a suggested code contribution. And if it gets merged, that is an attestation that it was meaningful. Yeah. It won't get merged if it's not meaningful. And so we're piggybacking off that to only, so that maintainers don't need to do anything separate because that's already like saying that this is a meaningful contribution. Now the next challenge is like not all pull requests are created equal.
Yeah, I was gonna say like I can edit a README file all day long. I don't know if I can make any meaningful code upgrades to like any of the stuff that people are building.
So that's the next challenge that we're working with now. So we're starting off simple and we're sort of iterating as we go. Right now you earn your annual contributor GitPOAP for a project by having at least one pull request merged. So you could have fixed a typo or you could have built the whole system and you get the same GitPOAP. The next thing that we're working on, which is extremely challenging, especially at scale, is how do you determine how impactful an individual is to a project? And you have lots of metrics like number of pull requests, lines of code, other projects the developers contribute to, all these different things. But like lines of code is not a great metric because you could have just updated like some utils file or whatever. Number of pull requests isn't great either because you maybe did 5 typo fixes as opposed to like core features. It's very hard to define. You could get a pretty good estimate based on underlying data, but it's hard to define what a truly like meaningful contribution is. So that's what we're doing is like right now doing research to figure out how we can actually do that effectively.
How does that work now? Like if you have an open source project that wants to figure out in a meaningful way who their most valuable contributors are, how do they reason about it now?
Usually, like if you ask a maintainer, they know. And it's usually with softer qualities around like understanding like the impact of what a person's work has done. But like a 1 character change that fixes a critical bug in like some DeFi protocol could have like $1 billion impact, but like it's a 1 character change that looks just like a typo fix. So we're also looking at things like, all right, like what file types are these changes happening in? And is there consistent contribution over time? For example, it's like, has this person contributed like every month for the last like 10 years, or is it just like sporadic? In terms of how people tell right now, like it's very hard to come up with the underlying metrics that can actually define it, but it's easy for a human to assess. So like, how can we provide tools that don't add more burden to maintainers, but allow them to signal who the most meaningful contributors are is an active research item for us right now.
Okay. And I mean, does GitPOAP integrate directly with the repositories? Is it listening to repositories, or is that like a sort of like, is there a decentralized aspect to this, or does it need to be,
Good question. So the cool thing about POAPs is they're self-sovereign. So like you hold them in your own wallet. So you're building up reputation that you bring with you.
Of course, the POAPs themselves are on the blockchain, platform. But it's more like the, getting data. I suppose it could also be different for every project. So like one project could attribute a lot of value to having core maintainers be decided by like a quorum of people, or perhaps even a DAO could say like these are the most important maintainers, and other projects might have like a benevolent dictator model where it's like one guy is deciding like these are the people who should be awarded the most valuable POAPs. So
right now what we're doing is, so our platform integrates, it basically pulls data from GitHub through the GitHub APIs and then issues POAPs through the POAP APIs. So we're sort of the platform that unites it. And we have a standard model of awarding these annual contributor POAPs, which is standard across all projects that we onboard. And soon what we're doing is we're building right now a view for maintainers, like the GitPOAP issuers, to create custom sets of GitPOAPs that they want to award that aren't just tied to software. And so that gives like a little bit more control in their hands for how they want to issue things. And I'm curious to see what people do with that, because I think that can tie into like sort of this softer, like who's a more meaningful contributor than others. And it also, what we don't want to do is like our specialty is essentially bringing contribution records on chain through issuing POAPs. And like, we're not experts at like assessing meaning of individual projects or like deciding what the most worthy things to reward. What we want to do is we want to build tools that enable maintainers to be able to do that on their own. And so we're trying to build generic tooling that allows the maintainers to do things and recognize like things that they already know and bring those on chain.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I mean, like every project's going to be different. Every project's going to have ways that they reason about these things. And so if you have sort of a generic, you could build standards and sort of more opinionated layers on top of that. But I suppose like having a generic standard makes more sense. And so, going like one step ahead of that. So now we know, how these things may get issued and what are the criteria upon which GitPOAPs might be awarded to developers. Once the developer has like 20 GitPOAPs for making like super important, meaningful contributions to code, how does that impact the developer, and what are some of the things that the developer can gain from having this like these badges of honor?
That's a great question. One thing is it's effectively like a self-sovereign verified resume. And like we're working on bringing utility to that through things like discounted tickets to conferences, different utility around like fun things like that, like airdrops that want to do like retroactive public goods funding. Now we have an on-chain record of like who's been an impactful contributor over time. We are tying into a number of recruiting platforms that are looking for developers, and they want to be able to figure out a way to search across like who's the most impactful developers in the ecosystem. So now like you can show up and possibly even like find a job that way, which is cool. And we're also using GitPOAP as a platform for contributors to find new projects to contribute to, and for projects looking for contributors to find like worthy contributors to come join. That's another way, is kind of just sort of this like matchmaking service of putting like-minded people in the same room.
I mean, maybe perhaps like to play devil's advocate here, like, I mean, it's great that you guys are building this on chain and everything. You have this verifiable record, and you know there's censorship resistant aspects to this as well, because like I think a lot of this data probably gets concentrated on GitHub, right? And I believe GitHub has some sort of badge. I mean, I don't use GitHub every day, but I believe it has like some kind of badge system where developers can be awarded some sort of badge for having contributed. But like, isn't that enough? Like,
it's a good question.
I mean, but if it's not, like, couldn't GitHub like build some sort of system that maintainers would be able to award badges, and then like people would have that on their profile, and could also put it, integrate it with TopTal or LinkedIn or whatever, like how?
Yeah, that's another good question. And like, I would say the big benefit of what we're doing, so GitHub is just the start for us, and we're eventually going to tie into other types of contribution platforms. So you could think like project management software like Trello, or like design software like Figma, and we can tie into all these platforms. And then the really important part here is that your record of contribution is self-sovereign, exists outside of each of those platforms. So like your GitHub badges really only show up on GitHub. And somebody has to look at your GitHub profile, know how those badges work to understand the meaning of them. Whereas like with GitPOAP, yes, the name is GitPOAP. Maybe we'll change it at some point as we broaden our vision. You have these standardized credentials that are like outside of any of these platforms. So like it can provide a more holistic view of you as a contributor, not just tied to one individual platform.
Okay, yeah.
And for onlookers too, like many people that aren't active GitHub users don't know how to digest the information on GitHub. And those badges, GitHub is actually working on rolling out more badges, which is a bit of validation in the sense that like these badges are a meaningful thing to do, but they're still stuck like on GitHub, and they're only for contributions that happen on GitHub. So I think it's important to have a separate system to collect all these attributions.
And on the other side, like you mentioned this at the top of our chat, is for projects, it can be also a meaningful way for them to find developers. So there could be some sort of bounty where if you fix this bug, or if you like a bounty, right? Like a bounty where you are awarded some sort of special limited edition GitPOAP because you fixed this thing, or you called in a bounty. Is there any traction around this sort of thing as well?
Exactly, like specific. That's another thing that we're working with some projects on right now, is like GitPOAP is a platform to help you grow your community of contributors and like turn like passive community members into active contributors. And how do you sort of incentivize that behavior, like through bounties or things like that? And how do you recognize like if somebody provided a really critical bug fix, like how do you recognize that as a higher level than just like somebody who did a typo? And coming up with ways to do that. We just actually recently rolled out on our site borders around the GitPOAPs that are based on underlying data of your contributions. Very elementary right now. It's based on pull requests, which is not a great metric, but it still gives a pretty good view of like if you did something that was really important, like now you have a gold border, or multiple contributions over time, now you have a gold border instead of a bronze border. And something like fixing a critical bug or completing a critical bounty could give you like a higher level, or like a rare or more difficult to get GitPOAP.
And I think if you get if you figure out the evaluating core contribution aspect, having one being awarded a GitPOAP could unlock like a DAO paying, right? So there's like all these kind of automated sort of payment flows that can then happen. I think like once you have the GitPOAP, then you're able to claim a reward that's being held by a DAO, etc. Like this.
Exactly. And like one of the benefits of building on the POAP ecosystem is GitPOAPs are POAPs under the hood.
Yeah.
And we have instant access to all of the POAP integrations that already exist. So like gated Discord servers, Telegram channels, Zoom calls for coordination. Like you can gate those on GitHub or with GitPOAPs.
Yeah.
You can also do gated GitHub repositories. So think about this. This is pretty cool. So we're working with Guild right now on a test around, you have a group of developers who worked on a project together that now have GitPOAPs.
Yeah.
And now you can create a gated GitHub repository based on GitPOAP holdings that you can restrict to people that you've like worked on specific projects for together. And so doing interesting stuff like that, like building all these tools, and I'm excited to see what people in the ecosystem do with this.
Cool. So it's an open platform. Anybody can use it. Like create their own GitPOAP and
exactly right now we're doing sort of manual onboarding of projects, but we're soon going to open up the platform. We have a request flow, so if anybody's interested, they can go to gitpoap.io/onboard and initiate the request flow for any projects they maintain or they contributed to. Soon we're going to open it up a little bit more to more customization and requesting, and we have an API if anybody's interested in ingesting GitPOAPs and sort of building on top of this on-chain reputation. And yeah, that's it.
Cool. That's really exciting. I love this. I mean, I'm not like developer, like I don't push code to I can code, but I don't push code to GitHub every day. But I think like this is such a cool thing. Like,
yeah, thanks.
Just,
it's fun. Hey, great talking to you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks.
Yeah.